I've never been the type to believe in anything supernatural. Ghosts? No way. Aliens? Please. But what happened to me last summer shook my confidence in reality itself. I don't know what to call it. People say, time slip. But even that feels inadequate. It's like I stepped out of the world I knew into something wrong. It was a late afternoon in June, and I was driving upstate to visit my cousin. It's a stretch of road I know well, mostly empty fields, a few trees here and there, and almost no traffic. I hadn't passed another car in miles. My GPS was telling me I still had about 2 hours to go, so when I saw a small, old-school diner off to the side of the highway, I figured I'd stop, grab a coffee, and stretch my legs. The place looked like something out of a 1950s postcard. Neon lights buzzing slightly, chrome details shining in the sun. It was almost too perfect, you know? I pulled into the gravel lot and parked. Inside, it was just as retro. Red leather booths, a checkered floor, a jukebox in the corner. There were only a couple of other people there, a trucker sitting at the counter and an elderly couple in the far booth. I sat down at the counter and ordered a coffee. The waitress, an older woman with a beehive hairstyle, smiled and asked if I wanted anything to eat. I wasn't really hungry, but something about the place felt comforting. So, I said sure, I'd take a slice of pie. The coffee was good, the pie was better, and before I knew it, I was lost in thought, staring out the window at the setting sun. When I finally checked my phone, I froze. It was 7:30 p.m. I'd only stopped for a quick break, maybe 20 minutes tops. But according to the clock, nearly 3 hours had gone by. I didn't understand. I hadn't fallen asleep, hadn't zoned out for that long, but the sun was lower in the sky, and the few cars I'd seen earlier on the road were gone. I stood up, feeling this growing pit of unease in my stomach, and went to the counter to pay. The waitress smiled like nothing was wrong, and I tried to shake it off as I handed her a 20. As I walked out, I glanced back at the clock on the wall above the register. 7:30 on the dot, just like my phone. I rushed to my car, feeling like I needed to get back on the road as soon as possible. But when I got back on the highway, something felt off. The familiar landscape I'd driven through earlier looked different, like it had aged. The grass along the road was taller. The trees seemed more gnarled and overgrown. I told myself it was just the fading light playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. By the time I reached the next town, I was desperate to get some answers. I pulled into a gas station and asked the attendant if he knew about the diner I'd stopped at. He gave me a confused look and said, "That old place. It's been closed down for decades." I thought he was messing with me. No, I was just there like half an hour ago. He shook his head. It burned down in the 70s. Ain't nothing there now but rubble. I didn't believe him. I drove back the way I came, determined to find it. But when I reached the spot where the diner had been, there was nothing but an empty lot. Overgrown weeds, a few scattered pieces of broken foundation, but no diner, no neon lights, no chrome booths, just a patch of land that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I sat there in my car, staring at the empty space where the diner had been, feeling like I was losing my mind. Had I imagined the whole thing? I had the receipt in my pocket, a crumpled piece of paper with the diner's name on it, and the time, 7:30 p.m. I never saw the diner again. I've driven that road countless times since then, but it's like it never existed. What really haunts me, though, isn't the thought of losing a few hours of my life. It's the nagging question of whether I ever came back to the right version of my life. Sometimes I wonder if I've been living in the wrong timeline ever since. I've never been a big believer in the strange or unexplained. But there's something that happened to me a few years ago that I can't shake. It's hard to even talk about because it sounds so unbelievable, but I know what I saw, what I experienced. And ever since, I haven't been able to trust reality the same way. It was back when I was looking to buy my first house. I was checking out this neighborhood on the outskirts of town, one of those quiet cookie-cutter suburbs where every house looks like it came off a factory line. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I'd been driving around, hoping to find something listed for sale that wasn't on the market yet. You know, just to get ahead of the competition. That's when I saw it. A house with an open house sign out front, balloons tied to the mailbox. It looked a little older than the others on the block, more weathered maybe, but nothing unusual. I figured it had potential. Plus, I had some time to kill. I parked, walked up the cracked sidewalk, and noticed the house had this weird, almost retro vibe to it. The front door was one of those old, heavy wooden types with a brass knocker. I rang the doorbell, expecting a realtor to greet me. But when the door swung open, there was no one there. The house was completely silent. I stepped inside, calling out, "Hello?" No answer. Weird, but maybe the agent was in another room. So I started walking through the place, checking out the rooms. The decor was like something straight out of the 1970s. Floral wallpaper, shag carpet, and these old-fashioned light fixtures. It felt off. Like the house had been frozen in time. Each room was eerier than the last. The furniture looked untouched, like no one had lived there in years, but there was no dust, no signs of decay, just an unsettling stillness. And the longer I wandered, the more I realized how quiet it was. No creaking floors, no hum of an air conditioner, no distant traffic noise, just silence. I started to feel anxious. Something about the place wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I pulled out my phone to check the time, and that's when I noticed something really bizarre. My phone screen was black, completely dead. It had been fully charged when I got out of the car, so I couldn't understand why it had died so suddenly. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I turned to leave, but as I passed by a mirror in the hallway, I swear to God, I saw a shadow move behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing. No one. I tried to convince myself I was just imagining things, but the tension in my chest wouldn't go away. I needed to get out of there. When I reached the front door and stepped outside, the first thing I noticed was how dark it had gotten. I'd only been inside for what felt like maybe 20 minutes, but the sun was setting. I glanced at my watch. 6:45 p.m. I had walked into the house at 3:30. 3 hours had passed. I couldn't make sense of it. I rushed back to my car, my mind racing, trying to understand how I'd lost that much time. I drove straight home, still feeling that creeping sense of dread. I thought about calling the realtor whose number was listed on the open house sign, but my phone wouldn't turn back on, no matter how long I charged it. The next day, I drove back to that neighborhood. I wanted to see the house again, maybe get some answers about what had happened. But when I got there, the house was gone. The lot was empty. Just an overgrown patch of weeds and a chain-link fence around it. I must have driven up and down that street a dozen times, thinking I had the wrong block or that I was remembering things wrong. But I knew that spot. The cracked sidewalk, the old mailbox. It had been there the day before, but now, nothing. I even asked some of the neighbors if they remembered the open house. No one knew what I was talking about. One woman who'd lived there for 20 years told me there hadn't been a house there since the 80s. It had been torn down after a fire. I never found that house again. It's like it disappeared off the face of the earth. I even asked around town, but no one seemed to know what I was talking about. It's terrifying to think that time isn't as stable as we believe it is, that it can just slip. And worse, what if it happens again? What if one day I step through a door and don't come back? I always thought stories about time travel or alternate dimensions were just science fiction. Fun to watch in a movie, sure, but not something that could ever happen to a regular person like me. but what happened to me last fall has left me questioning everything. Sometimes I still wonder if I'll ever get an answer, or if I'm stuck living in someone else's version of reality. It all started when I was driving to a friend's house for a get-together. I'd been there a dozen times before, so I knew the route like the back of my hand. It was just a simple drive through the suburbs, nothing special. But that day, for some reason, I took a wrong turn. I wasn't even sure how it happened. I had music playing, wasn't in a hurry, and before I knew it, I was on this narrow, tree-lined road I didn't recognize. I thought, no big deal, I'll just turn around. But the road was too narrow for that, and there were no signs, no side streets, nothing. I figured I'd follow it until I hit a main road. I've lived in this town for years, so I assumed it'd connect back to somewhere I knew. Except it didn't. The further I drove, the more the road seemed to stretch on. It was oddly straight, with no curves or hills, just this endless line of trees on either side. After what felt like 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen a single other car, no houses, not even any animals. It was like I was the only person around. That's when the weirdness started to sink in. I checked the clock on my dashboard. It was already past 5 p.m. I'd left my house at 3:30, and the drive was supposed to take half an hour. I'd been on that road for over an hour without realizing it. I felt my chest tighten, a slow creeping dread spreading through me. Something wasn't right. I pulled over and got out, hoping a break would clear my head. The air was cool, and the only sound was the wind rustling the trees. No birds, no distant hum of traffic, just an eerie silence. I walked a little ways down the road, looking for any sign, any landmark. But it was all the same, just an endless stretch of road that seemed to lead nowhere. When I got back in my car, I tried using my GPS, but it couldn't find my location. My phone had full battery, full signal, but it kept showing, searching for signal. My stomach dropped. I turned the car around and started driving back the way I came, but after what felt like hours, I hadn't found the highway or the intersection I'd turned off from. It was like the road was looping or stretching itself out. Panic started creeping in. I was running low on gas, the sun was getting lower, and I had no idea where I was. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, I saw a break in the trees up ahead. A small side road led to a street I recognized, and before I knew it, I was back in familiar territory, pulling into my friend's driveway. Relief flooded over me, but when I checked the time again, it was almost 8 p.m. I was 3 hours late. I sat there in the car, trying to piece it together. There was no way I could have been lost for that long. The road felt like it went on forever, but I hadn't been driving that long. I was only out of the way for what felt like maybe an hour, tops. My friend came outside, concerned, asking where I'd been. I told him the whole story, but he just looked at me like I was nuts. He said there was no road like the one I described anywhere near his house. I figured I must have just gotten really turned around, let my imagination get the better of me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A few days later, I decided to retrace my steps, to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. I drove the same route, took the same turn, but the road wasn't there. The intersection where I'd turned off didn't even exist. The trees, the narrow stretch of asphalt, it was all gone. In its place was a cul-de-sac lined with new houses. I drove around for hours, searching for any trace of the road, but it was like it had vanished. I even looked at old maps of the area, but there was nothing. No record of a road where I'd been. It's been almost a year now, and I still haven't found that road again. It doesn't show up on any maps, and no one I've talked to remembers it ever existing. I've stopped telling people about it because they just look at me like I'm crazy. But the worst part isn't that I lost a few hours. It's the creeping suspicion that when I found my way back, I didn't come back to the same world I left.